Ho, 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 and welcome to the second door of our TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2021. Today, I find myself standing on a cold and frosty morning in the back garden of Roundwood Towers, and here, as I sneak a peek in through the window of the conservatory, I can see Sidney inside, hanging his baubles on the tree. I wonder if we can interrupt him and just ask him about some of his wargaming inspirations.
It's the 2nd of December, and on this frosty morning, I'd like to open the Advent window on one of my favourite military books and describe how it inspired me to write a critical part of my rules for recreating the battles of the 30 Years' War. And that book is Pallas Armata by Sir James Turner, a Scottish professional soldier, which was written by him in the years between 1670 and 1671. Sir James had a considerable experience of campaigning and battles in the 17th century, including in Germany with the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, and both in the British Civil Wars and also the Scottish killing times of the 1660s, just after the Restoration. I've mentioned his book before on the Oddcast, possibly in passing also on previous Advent calendars, because it's a really remarkable guide to Sir James's view of how to command an army, how to raise, protect, pay for an army, and the different ways of marching and organising an army, including, perhaps most importantly for our purposes, how to use such an army on the field of battle. There are so many insights in Sir James's writing that it's impossible to mention them all. The book is a real inspiration to wargaming in the 17th century, but one aspect has always really struck me, and that's the inspiration I want to cover today. So when Sir James Turner wrote of the deployment of an army, he paid very close attention to the creation, composition and deployment of a reserve of troops in a battle. He described which troops should be included, identified the optimum type of troops, and he wrote about the precise location at which the reserve should be placed. And that care and attention was connected with the importance of a battlefield reserve in the period of history in which Sir James Turner was writing. And that was a period where states and kingdoms were still represented on the battlefield by monarchs, princes, dukes and electors. So the existence of a battlefield reserve is intimately connected with the continuation of the power of those individuals and the survival of their countries. Without a functioning military reserve, a king or prince could face real dangers internally, which were far beyond the military consequences which might otherwise arise during a campaigning year. With a credible reserve, a king or a prince could continue fighting in a war, raise funds on the promise of using his armies in a future campaign, and also quell internal unrest and preserve their legitimacy. So for that reason, I wanted to make the military reserve of each side central to our 2mm war games of the 30 Years' War. In those rules, the creation and use of an army reserve would be a critical component of each player's wargame and a real metric of their success on the tabletop. Generally, each player would organise their formations into the typical battlefield commands of centre, left ring, right ring, and also importantly a reserve, and they would place their tercios, brigades, battalions or squadrons into one of those locations. But players were free in a section of the war game before the action started, which we call the Council of War, to place a number of units into the reserve. There are advantages for doing that in the context of increasing the number of force morale points a player would have at their disposal. But there would always be downsides of doing so. The greater the size of the reserve, the fewer troops a player would actually have on the battlefield when the action started, and correspondingly, the more quickly a decision would come as to whether the player had to deploy their reserve. As the action commenced, the reserve played no part in the battle until it had been deployed by the player concerned. Until the point at which the reserve was deployed, units broken in fighting did not adversely affect that player's force morale, or if you like, their army integrity. But once a reserve was deployed by a commander, units which were broken would adversely affect the force morale of that force unless they were withdrawn. In gaming terms, that represented the key point in the battle, as emphasised in Sir James's book, being the critical moment when the reserve was deployed. Before that point, the battle was being fought, but not necessarily to a conclusion which would greatly impact the course of a campaign. The action was skirmishing, but less than a decisive action between the forces. But once the reserve was deployed, the importance of the battle had evolved and was increased considerably. In such a situation, a famous victory could then be achieved, or a shattering defeat suffered. Other things happened on the tabletop as a result. Players started to carefully look at the tabletop situation before taking a decision to deploy their reserve. They were weighing up the relative merits of their battlefield situation at that point. Each side also carefully preserved their mounted troops, and in particular light cavalry such as Croats or Finns or Tartars, to serve as an arm of exploitation in the field to rout any broken units and therefore damage the enemy's force morale as soon as their opponent had made the decision to deploy their reserve. And that seemed to me to be very representative of the tactics of some of those forces in battles in the 30 Years' War. So by using Sir James Turner's book and creating a rule for how a reserve was to be created and deployed, we were trying to get players to identify a key moment in battle on which history would turn. And that was very much in line with battles such as Lutzen, Nordlingen, White Mountain and Breitenfeld, which were similarly decisive and turned on a key moment of history like that. And in that regard, the rules served almost to create some of the narratives in our games, which corresponded with the historical accounts of 30 Years' War actions. And there was an explanation of why some commanders would pull their army away without using a reserve at a time when, in hindsight, we might have felt victory was achievable. And we could see that happening on our tabletop in our games, which were then echoing the battles where commanders did deploy reserves and were either successful or lost everything in the field. So to us, it was a good example of using one book as the inspiration for a very practical aspect of a set of war games rules.